This morning I called a professor at the Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center at the University of Toronto. His most recent book, Moral Courage, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists, was published by G Editions, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste in the description panel on the upload for this video. Dr. Anthony, thank you so much for making the time. I'm very happy that you're here.
Thank you for the invitation. Very pleased to be with you.
That is wonderful. Moral Courage. I think it's a very interesting book. I saw the details of the publication for the book when it was posted on a Twitter account by the Zimbabwean journalist Hopol Chingona. I had to give a shout out to him. So I'm going to want us to start to talk about your book. And initially, I want to know what motivated you to write this book. And if you're also able to just give us a down of what you consider to be the core ideas of the book and its central argument.
So I have been researching journalists for the past 23 years, in particular journalists who work in very difficult situations, war zones, areas of conflict. And one of the questions that intrigues me is, what makes journalists do work that can be considered very dangerous? Why do they do it? Why do they take on a job that they know will come with many negative consequences for them? And the book on moral courage is an exploration of what makes journalists do this kind of work, what motivates them, and what keeps them doing it. And the idea behind moral courage is that I believe it is the antidote to what may be seen as moral injury. So let me try and define a couple of terms for you. So moral injury refers to a condition that can arise from witnessing or perpetrating or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be associated with feelings of shame and guilt, anger, and disgust. Now, it's not a mental illness, but it's clearly a phenomenon that can be very uncomfortable to experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the journalists who I've profiled in this book, I believe all have the potential to develop moral injury because they're working in situations in which the moral fabric of society is broken down.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, take Russia, where you're living in a very repressive regime. You've got a leader who's very dictatorial. Civil society has been dismantled. The judiciary is in the control of the government. There's no free press. The NGOs have been forced to leave the country.
Mm-hmm.
What remains? What remains of civil society? What remains is a few journalists who are prepared to step out and say, this is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Our democracy is imperiled. This is not the way our government or our leaders should be behaving. And so the journalists who do this in Russia can pay a very heavy price for it. What makes them do it? I believe it's a sense of moral courage that becomes the antidote to moral injury. So for these journalists, keeping quiet, saying nothing, becomes a sense of moral hurt. This is intolerable to them. And rather than keep quiet, they would rather speak up and say, this is unacceptable, even though they know that by doing so, they're going to be hammered very hard by the government or by the leader. And the same argument applies to all the other countries that are profiled in the book. Zimbabwe, Belarus, Azerbaijan, etc. These are journalists who feel they cannot keep quiet because by keeping quiet, they bring on a sense of moral injury. And that's a very uncomfortable emotion for them. To keep moral injury at bay, they have moral courage. And so they speak out and make this, they make a point by calling the leaders on their bad behavior.
You decided to specifically profile 19 journalists or 19 investigative journalists across the world. How did you pick these journalists to appear in your book? Were you using a very particular criteria to identify and isolate their work.
Right. So these are journalists who, for the most part, come from countries where there's a terrible record of press freedom. Iran, Russia, Belarus, etc. So number one, you're starting off with countries that don't respect freedom of the press.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there are going to be particular journalists whose stories just resonated with me because of their remarkable courage, etc. So it was a combination of, let me focus on a country with a bad record of press freedom, and you can find out which these countries are by looking at an index of press freedom through things like Reporters Sans Frontières. They list the countries from number one down to, I think, 180, 190 in terms of their record in relation to press freedom. What are the countries that respect press freedom? The countries that are at the top of the list are generally Scandinavian countries. The countries at the very bottom are countries like North Korea, Russia, Belarus, etc. I looked at the bottom end of the spectrum. I focused on those countries with a terrible record of press freedom. And then I went looking for journalists who, in these countries, speak out, who, despite the great risks, are still prepared to stand up and say, this is wrong. We can't run a country like this. And so that's how I started to make my selection. It's not always about journalists who take on bad governments. It's also about journalists who speak out against crime and corruption as well. So, for example, if you look at countries like Mexico, very, very dangerous country for journalists because of the drug cartels. But the journalists who are prepared to stand up and write about it, to speak about it, even they know that the cartels can come after them.
Mm-hmm.
The journalist from Paraguay that I profiled, Candido Figueredo Ruiz, is also a man who took on the drug cartels, who was prepared to speak out against the violence and the bribery and the corruption that comes with the drug cartels. And he does so at a very considerable risk to himself. So it's not always about bad governments. It can also be about crime and corruption that takes place in some of these countries. And the examples there are Paraguay and Mexico, two examples of that. But for the most part, it relates to bad governments, dictatorial rulers. The strongmen of this world, Vladimir Putin in Russia, the leader in Belarus, India right now, which is going through a very difficult period in terms of press freedom. And the journalists who prepare to call out the governments pay a very heavy price for doing so. They have a rare moral courage that allows them to do this kind of work.
I could tell, from reading your work that it feeds into this discourse of conflict journalism. And I would like you to just give us, some highlights of what you would consider to be the major contribution of your work to the discourse and to the broader field of conflict journalism.
Yeah, thank you for that. So when I started my work with journalists back in 1999, I found out that there wasn't a single publication, not one, in the literature devoted to journalists, trauma, and emotional health. Really quite a surprising omission because there's a very big trauma literature out there on veterans, soldiers, victims of assault, rape, etc. But there hadn't been a single publication written on journalists who report on war. And so to address this gap in the literature, I wrote a grant application and sent it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C., saying, did you know that there's no study looking at journalists and how they respond emotionally to war? And the Freedom Forum funded the very first study of emotional health in war journalists. And that was work that I authored, and we published this in the American Journal of Psychiatry back in 2001, 2002. And that started me on this journey of exploration. So initially, I focused on Western journalists who fly into war zones to report on conflict. And we published a number of papers in relation to that. For example, Western journalists who flew into Iraq to cover the war in 2003, published a paper on that. But then I was approached by NGOs. UNESCO also approached me saying, well, your work has focused up to now on Western journalists who fly into war zones, but what about looking at journalists working in countries that are in conflict? What about countries that are struggling because of press freedom? What about those countries in which journalists are being targeted by drug lords and criminal elements? And so my work started to shift from Western journalists to journalists working in other countries, for example, Mexico, Kenya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, looking at the same thing. How do journalists in those countries cope emotionally with covering very difficult news? And what makes these countries so interesting, and what differentiates them from the Western journalists that I studied, is that these journalists are living and working in the midst of very difficult situations. The Western journalists can fly in and they can fly out. They can go for 4 to 6 weeks to a war zone, and they come back to a safe place like Canada or the United States to rest, to recuperate. But the journalists who are working in Mexico, for example, don't have that respite. They are surrounded by violence. They are surrounded by danger. Their communities are being targeted by drug cartels. And what these journalists have to put up with is not just the personal threat against themselves, but also the threats that's directed towards their families. So this is what the drug cartels have learned. This is what bad governments have learned. If you want to silence a journalist, don't just target the journalist, target their families, target their parents, their children, etc. And so you can see that the situation becomes even more hazardous for these journalists. And that's where I focused my work over the last few years, which is how do these journalists cope? How do they respond to this? What are the psychological consequences of working in places like this? And most importantly, what motivates them to do this very important work? Because what's become evident to me is that these journalists often represent the very last vestiges of civil society. Think of Zimbabwe, a country that you know so well. What's happened in Zimbabwe? Well, so much of civil society has been shelled out by bad government. What's left? Often is a few courageous journalists, someone like Hopewell, who's able to step up and say, this is wrong. Government shouldn't be doing this. This is not how a democratic country is supposed to behave. And that takes a rare courage to do so. For me, it's a moral courage. And that's the focus of this current book on moral courage. What makes these journalists step out and call bad governments on their behavior, even though they know that the consequences for them are going to be very severe?
Interesting. Thank you so much. I believe from that experience of working with journalists, interviewing journalists, and researching about, the kind of work they do in environments that are very hazardous, as you say, what could you say are the major lessons that you have drawn? And I want you to answer this question maybe from a neurological perspective, which is what you specifically focus on. What would you say are the major lessons that you have picked from this experience?
Well, I think when you work in very dangerous situations, like some of these journalists do, you are going to be vulnerable to developing some psychological difficulties, potentially. Now, the journalists that I profiled in Moral Courage don't necessarily have conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder. But from my earlier research, looking at journalists who go to war zones, you definitely see this. You see a condition like post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, occurring more frequently in journalists who do this kind of tough work. What's really quite surprising about the work on moral courage is that, the journalists who take on this difficult work, after they will confront a lot of danger, they can feel fear, they can have a lot of anxiety, but these are very strong individuals psychologically. They are psychologically robust. They've got a resilience that allows them to take on this difficult work, even though the governments come after them, they lock them up, they try and destroy them financially, they may torture them, they want to deprive them of their livelihoods, etc. Despite these very severe stressors that these journalists go through, the majority will not develop post-traumatic stress disorder. They won't develop crippling psychological difficulties. It says to me that they've got a very strong inbuilt psychological resilience to withstand this. But not all journalists have that kind of resilience. And certainly from time to time, I've come across journalists who've been brought down very hard by conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder or major depression or generalized anxiety disorder, etc. That becomes one of the occupational hazards of doing work like this.
That is great, Dr. Anthony. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate the time that you have made to give this interview.